microphone, that's the tricky part. So, here we are. Welcome to the closing session of the 2006 NMC Summer Conference. Just as a little look back over the last couple days, wrote down some words, some things to reflect. So we can think of the Intercontinental Hotel and the Peter B. Lewis building. Those were pretty significant. Started with digital storytelling and gaming workshops. Then we were kind of propelled into the future with Brenda Laurel and what she had to share with us on the opening keynote. Many, many sessions. We had so many choices and not enough of us to go around to see all the wonderful things that were here. There were tours to gaming and virtual reality areas. And then, of course, there was the jamming at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yeah! Now, last night, we got to take a look into Second Life, and I know there's much more in store with that. And this morning, we're going to go even deeper into the future with Merlin Donald. Okay. Okay, so I hope that you had a great time, that you just keep the spirit with you. And I would like to bring up now Len Steinbach, who is the Chief Information Officer at the Cleveland Museum of Art, who is also one of the co-hosts of this event. Len is going to be introducing Merlin Donald.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Cleveland Museum of Art has been so pleased to welcome all of you to Cleveland. I know I saw a lot of you at our exhibition at MoCA last night, and I hope you got a chance to see that. I hope some of you will wander over after the closing session to Parade the Circle, which is an extraordinary national event. Well, I'm very pleased to have been asked to introduce Dr. Merlin Donald, who is the founding chair of the Department of Cognitive Science at Case Western Reserve University. That title doesn't say enough about that department in that the focus there is on human creativity, which makes this all the more important. Merlin has been involved with the issues of media, social and neurological evolution, and I'm reading from one particular note from his bio, a cognitive neuroscientist with a background in philosophy. Think about that for a moment. And what is particularly wondrous and amazing is that if you have a chance to speak to him personally, as I have from time to time, you realize how that all flows together in his consciousness of what is going on around us and how it is important to all of us and why we need to recognize what is going on within ourselves and the society around us and in this strange media mix environment. And it's a perfect coda to our session. Last night we saw Second Life. I do not know where that falls in any sort of cognitive neurological spectrum. I just, out of body, out of mind. Sometimes when I was on Second Life, I thought I was out of my mind. So, and I should also mention that the title, Understanding the New Dynamic, Art, Technology, and the Mind, also draws from the title of an extraordinary symposium that the New Media Consortium sponsored with Cleveland Institute of Art, MoCA, and the Cleveland Museum of Art that Merlin was instrumental in founding and developing, which brought people from all around the world to try to find out what that new dynamic is and how we can deal with it, explore it, or understand it. Well, with that and my own shared anticipation for this lecture, Please let me introduce Dr. Merlin Donald.
Thank you, Len. I hope I'm mic'd properly here. Good. I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I think this is a very important audience, and I'm anxious to communicate some of my ideas as effectively as I can in an hour or so. I think that the media are part of really a revolutionary change in the world, and when you look at the world from the perspective of your own lifetime, there's been enough change, but if you look at it as I have over the last 5 million years in terms of human evolution, the rate of change appears so fast as it raises the question of its sustainability, and it raises the question of whether we're smart enough to manage the things that we've created. So what I'm trying to do today is to review some basic ideas about the history of the human race, and our relationship with technology in particular will come up in the second half of the talk, but I want to give some kind of background to this, cognitive background, actually. Okay, so the topic is the new dynamic. Now, the word dynamic is important because you have to keep in mind that social change, evolution, changes to the brain, physical change, if you want, technological change, are all part of a dynamic system. And it's a nonlinear system. That is, it's a system that can change in very unpredictable and rapid ways. Now, I just want to focus for a minute on the notion of creativity and where the amazing innovative capacity of human beings might have come from. You look at this image now. This is an image that made the cover of Time magazine some 30 years ago or so from a university near where I taught for years, the University of Ottawa. A group of innocent young engineering students are being photographed as they are initiated into the university. And some photographer has captured just that exquisite moment just before the impact, of all this water. And if I showed this picture to any other creature in the biosphere of Earth, they would just look at it and wouldn't have any strong reaction, not even an intelligent monkey or ape. Human being looks at it, and of course you chuckle, and because you can imagine the future. You look at it and you know what's about to happen. Now, how do you do that? This is just a static picture, but you can sort of fast forward for an event that actually isn't going to happen. It's just a picture, and you can imagine, first of all, a reaction in this group of people as they get soaked to the skin, and you can imagine the people up above laughing and falling on the floor, convulsed in laughter and so on. And you can also imagine lawsuits and all kinds of other things that might have followed. The thing is that as a human being, you have this ability to move back and forth in time in your imagination, in the virtual world in which, in fact, you live. And artists understand that, and here's a work of art from about 80 years ago, Rudolf Schlichter, and of course this imagination of ours is highly irrational. If you look at this painting, it's making comments in various ways that are hard to code in words. There are comments about femininity, about childhood, about aging, about hierarchy, social hierarchy, about technology, about our attitude towards the body. All sorts of things are coming into this painting. And it's, I would argue, essentially related to our ability to move back and forth in time, to imagine futures, to imagine virtual worlds, and so on. And the whole question of cognitive neuroscience, in a way, is how did we evolve this amazing capacity? Where did it come from, and what does it tell us about ourselves? Well, one of the things that's true about humans is that we're primates. That is, we are genetically very, very close to monkeys and apes, and our brains are very, very similar. But the brains of primates, by the way, are quite different from the brains of creatures like cats and dogs and whales and so on. Each major category in biology has a different type of brain, and we're very much primates, down to our toes, And the primate brain has a particular set of characteristics, and we have those same characteristics. And for about 30 years, people have been looking for the magic bullet, the formula for humanness, the thing that makes us so extraordinary. And to tell you the truth, we haven't found it yet. Amazingly, we seem to be doing the things we're doing with a gigantic primate brain. It's much bigger than the average primate. Our brain is about 7 times as big as it should be if we were, let's say, leopards or average mammals. There's a way of quantifying brains against the average for different types of animals, and we have about 7 times as much brain as we should for our body weight. But that doesn't necessarily in itself mean that we would be empowered to do the things we do, the extraordinary things we do. Now, primates know a lot. They're very intelligent creatures, and you look at this little female bonobo, and she's sitting in a group, and she has a baby, and she's imagining something. And she has in her mind a virtual world. In a way, it's sort of like your virtual world. It is a world in which all of the environment is contained and all of the players, and yet within that, she can focus her attention. So she can take a particular small part of that world and focus on that little part. And that's what we all do. We carry around a large-scale imagination image of the world, and we focus on smaller parts of it. Now, the amazing thing about that image is that we know that it does not correspond to physical reality exactly. So, for example, there's a famous experiment, and I was once witness to this. It's an incredible experiment where they put a person in front of a computer screen, and you look at a page of print, and it's just random numbers. It looks like the page of a newspaper, but in fact, what's on the page are numbers and letters just clustered so they look like words and sentences, but they don't mean anything. However, the person sitting in front of the screen has an eye movement tracker on so that the computer knows exactly where the person's eye is on the screen at any moment. And at that point, it substitutes real words and meaningful sentences. From the subjective point of view of the person reading the text, they think it's a newspaper in front of them. And what it is, it's a screen full of random numbers. But just because they are looking at that small focal point, they piece together the whole page of a newspaper. To the observer standing behind the person, and I've been in this situation where you stand behind them, and it's incredible because you can't find anything on that page that's meaningful. You just can't. Their eyes moving very rapidly, and the letters are changing constantly. So, in fact, you construct this world, and this world that this bonobo has in her mind is an imaginary world. She scans the environment sort of not randomly, but in a systematic way, picks up bits and pieces of images and constructs this world, which she carries around in her imagination. This is the part of the world she may be actually looking at a given moment. So this is an amazing ability. We know that other animals have it to some degree, but what we seem to be able to do is we can actually time travel in that imaginary world. We can manufacture worlds, as it were. And it's not clear how we do this. We're very interested in finding out. Well, I worked out some years ago in the first book I wrote. It was called Origins of the Modern Mind, about 15 years ago. Tried to take all of the evidence that we had from many, many different fields about human origins, and came to the conclusion that the first big cognitive leap of humanity away from the apes towards this kind of imagination was about 2 million years ago. And oddly enough, it was due to a revolution in our ability to control our bodies. And I've used the word the human actor to describe what happened at that point, because we're primarily, as a species, we're actors on stage. When we get together in a group, we perform. We're very outgoing, and we're very, very social. In fact, human beings die without that social contact. And the way we know this was happening 2 million years ago is that tools started appearing. Fairly complicated tools appear fairly soon afterwards, within a few 100,000 years. And tool-making industries require you to be able to imagine the shape and final form of the tool, as well as to remember and imagine the kinds of materials you need and so on, because you can't make these tools out of just anything. Well, the particular neurological adaptation, which may or may not interest you, but it certainly interests me, behind this, I think, is related to what's called the mirror neuron systems of the brain. And those mirror neurons allow you to perceive the actions of others as if they were your own. So your mirror neurons mean that if you see me getting angry, you also might get angry. If I see you grieving, I might also feel very sad, and so on. It also means that I can imitate or mime your actions very easily because I represent them in an objective way. I realize that when I do this, it's the same thing that you do, even though it doesn't look anything like the same. Well, here's an example of how that system works. You have this ability, which no other creature in the universe has, to plan an action in imagination, and then you can execute it. And if you're anything like me at diving, you know that when I jump off the board, I have zero reflection. I just suddenly find myself in the water. Most people are like this, and I've always been amazed that somebody can go and jump in the air and do 4 or 5 things and then land. You know, I have no idea how they do that. But you can be sure that they rehearse it in their imaginations over and over again, and then they review their performance, and they correct it in their imagination. Then they try again. How do they do this? Well, from a point of view of a neuroscientist, it's a mystery indeed, because what it involves is mapping a pattern onto a motor pattern. Now, a very good example is rhythm. Animals don't do these things at all, by the way. Human beings are the only ones who can do the kinds of things I'm describing. A rhythm is an abstract pattern in time, okay? And it can be represented in lights, sound, vibration, touch, body sense, many, many different ways. And if you've ever been to a rock concert, you know that the rhythm is being picked up by people in all these different ways at the same time. And it can be played out. That's a perceptual thing. Eh? That's in the back of your brain. That is a very complicated perception of something that is taking place in time. And the amazing thing is that your brain enables you to play that out on all sorts of different muscle systems that are known to be very different, and in most animals are autonomous. You don't have a lot of control. So you have eyes, head, arms, hands, hips, legs, feet, and as you know, a good dancer can even dilate the eyes. You can change the whiteness of your eyes. You can use your abdomen. I mean, there's any number of things you can do. And how's that possible? Well, it implies the existence of something that I call a mimetic controller. It's the ability to take a pattern in your perceptual imagination and turn it into muscle patterns on the outside. So it means that, well, why is this significant? It's significant because the only thing your brain can do is contract muscles. Your brain is the only path to the outside world that it has are these nerves that come down, the cranial nerves and the nerves that go down the spinal cord, and all it can do is contract muscles. So the only way your brain can communicate with someone else is to be able to contract muscles. And most animals, all they can do with their muscles are standard things like eating, jumping, mating, climbing trees, whatever. And so what they do with their understanding of the world is decide which of their standard repertoire of responses to use. But you take a human child and you present him with a rhythm, and suddenly the child is improvising and using the body to reproduce what the child has heard. And I've seen a child spend an afternoon learning how to stand on one foot because his brother can stand on one foot and he wanted to learn how to stand on foot. Yeah, it's a remarkable thing. So that human beings had to be able to do this in order to do some of the things we did even 2 million years ago, such as manufacturing tools. To be able to imagine a future and represent it in action, to play it out. Now, some people call that event perception or event reenactment. I call it mimesis because I think that most art, most music, and a lot of nonverbal communication, ritual, in other words, the stuff of human culture is nonverbal communication, it amounts to that kind of mimetic expression. I think that took place about 2 million years ago, that change, and the key was that human beings suddenly became able to control one another's attention. So now, let's look at some of the things we do as a species. Right from the time a child is born, it responds to other people by trying to control their attention. Now, this is a very interesting experiment that was done 20 years ago, a very famous experiment, showing that neonates, newly born babies, will reflect the expressions of their mothers to some degree. And of course, we get into this loop of interacting with one another from the time we were born. But the interesting thing was about this experiment was that when they, this is where the media come in. It shows you how powerful they can be. They discovered that a baby would respond to a television image of the mother's face just as well as to the live mother herself. So they rigged up a setup whereby there was a television camera on the mother's face and a television in front of the baby. So the mother could stand over here and interact with her baby through the television screen, and the baby would respond to it very, very strongly. So they videotaped the session. That is, they videotaped the mother's expression while the baby was interacting with her. Took a break, came back and replayed the video of the mother that the baby had just been interacting with, smiling and laughing and so on. And what do you think happened? The baby lost interest in about 2 seconds watching a video. Now, this is an important lesson for you because it tells you something about the difference between active and passive watching. As long as the baby was watching the mother live on the television screen, the baby had the illusion that he or she was controlling the mother's response, all right? Because the mother's responding instantaneously, with the baby would smile, the mother would smile, so on and so on. If you take that away and you just show the video, the exact same stimulus from an objective psychological point of view, the baby's not going to be interested because the baby has no control over it. So we're right from the get-go, we're people that interact and want to control one another's attention. And when we control someone else's attention, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm controlling your attention. I'm directing your attention to certain ideas and certain images and so on. And we have a tendency to try to do this as human beings. And when we have a conversation, it's a huge, complicated wrestling match, not all of it being verbal, in which you're trying to control one another's attention, one another's memory, one another's virtual world, if you want. And we do this, for example, this famous eyebrow flash is found in every culture around the world. It's an involuntary, very rapid, within about 200 milliseconds, raising of the eyebrows that people have when they encounter one another and they just acknowledge one another's existence. It's a kind of a reflexive thing. We have greeting rituals. They vary from culture to culture, but every culture has greetings that indicate social distance. They show how intimate or how distant you are, whether you're angry at someone, and so on. Greetings can be very informative and very efficient in communicating certain things. We also have the tendency, it's a very mimetic tendency to express closeness with similar gestures, similar postures and expressions. And I was talking about this to some group in Brussels about a few years ago, of linguists. And the linguists sat two people in a room. He was interested in local accents in Belgium. And there were many different variations on accents. And what he'd found is that he sat two people in a room and filmed them and recorded their conversation and then did a very sophisticated analysis of their accents. After about 30 or 40 minutes, their accents start converging. You start imitating some features of the other person's speech. And if you've ever been in a foreign country that spoke English, such as Britain or Ireland and so on, you might find that you're drawn into a certain mimetic matching of some, at least some. You may not be able to imitate the whole accent, but you're drawn in that direction. Again, gaze, terribly important in humans. In most animals, if you stare at an animal, it's either fight or submit. It's an aggressive thing. In humans, it's also bonding. It's also informative. We monitor one another's gaze to see who's looking at whom and what potential relationships there may be out there that we didn't know about, and so on. We're very good at this. And to give you an idea of just how far this goes, here's a game that's played in the Middle East, and the game is the child is not allowed to laugh. You stare and stare and stare, and of course, the adult usually is better than outlast the child, and the child eventually giggles. But you have to think, what kind of a species are we that we invent games like this? You just stare at one another, and it's fun, But it's interactive. Who can outlast whom? And children start generating these little gestures and moves and so on from a very young age. Young children can understand simple gestures at 9 months, believe it or not. And there's one, by the way, that's a fish. You know, if you want to imitate a fish to a child, you do this. A 9-month-old child will understand that that's a fish. It's interesting. Now, again, I translate that into we're embodied. It's our bodies. We are extraordinarily good at mapping things that we see in the world, events, onto our bodies and producing reenactments of those events. So, for example, the child sees an argument or sees a little baby being put to bed, goes downstairs, gets a doll, and does exactly the same thing with the dolls, right? We have this tendency to reenact, to reperform, to theatricalize, to coin a horrible word, our whole existence. And it's because of our imaginations, because we have this event representational capacity in our imaginations. We carry around a virtual world, and we tend to play it out in action. Now, that's a very important thing. Of course, this can become formalized, as in these rather strange gestures. I find the one for intoxication particularly interesting. I don't tend to do that when I'm intoxicated, but I sort of get, I think I get the idea, you know, and these are Hindu temple dance formal gestures, and they can tell elaborate stories using these gestures and so on. And similar formal systems exist all over the world. So mimetic culture is a culture that emerges out of this ability that we have, and it's very compelling and very important part of us. And it's not an accident, I think, that as culture has become popularized, you know, the thing about the media is that they've allowed mass culture for the first time in world history to become a dominant force. And it's not an accident that it's mostly mimetic. You look at a rock video, it's 90% mimetic. You'll see what I mean as I go through this talk. It's fundamental. But you know, initially, way back when human beings were struggling with really fundamental problems like how to keep a fire going, how to capture fire and keep it going, you know, for weeks and weeks and weeks, not easy. You have to have a means of communicating skill, of expressing your group coherence in a nonverbal way. And in fact, we still do that in the form of, you had a big party at the Rock Hall the other night. Well, you know, it's essentially the same thing, carnival. It's pure mimesis. I mean, there's nothing in there of what you think of as abstract, symbolic communication, logical thought, that kind of thing. But if you think of it as an embodied creature that's trying to represent events and tendency to conform, that is big tendency to imitate one another, then it starts to make sense. Of course, this kind of culture is also very creative because it has a lot to do with the rehearsal and transmission of skills, and skills can be refined to the nth degree so that you end up with entire hierarchies of culture personified in things like Cleveland Institute of Music nearby here, which has these extraordinarily talented young people who are selected from a nationwide pool and carry talent to a very high level. It's the same process, but it's being carried out in thousands and thousands of people, and the culture itself generates patterns that are replicated through these people and through this sort of social mechanism that supports the whole thing. Now, I think that evolutionarily is the primary basis of human culture, and I think that everything is built on that foundation. That is, even language comes from that foundation initially. And the second breakthrough, which I think is particular to our species and is more than probably 150,000 years old, which for me is yesterday, okay, so you have to see this in terms of millions of years, is the ability to tell stories. Now, the language didn't sort of fall out of the sky. I don't believe in a Chomskyan language chip that somehow pre-equips a child, you know, for language. I think it's built out of components that are there in mimetic culture and were elaborated over a long period of time as we became more vocal in our behavior. Mythic culture is a product of having language. Basically, you have stories, and some stories become dominant and become so dominant that people's lives are built around them. Now, you'll notice in this illustration, it's a very old illustration from Lumsden 20 or so years ago. That little network up here of abstract things, nodes that we think of as words or morphemes and various other names we have for them, is doing an interesting thing. Instead of you having an imaginary event in your head, and the events are up here, the animals and the hunt and so on, the story is presumably about the hunt, you can do this mimetically. I mean, you can do this in terms of a sort of charade-like theater or ritual re-performance of the hunt. And we do that in a variety of ways. But words let you do it much more efficiently. And I think that what words do is they move the beam of attention around in your imagination at very high speeds in remarkable ways. And so language suddenly becomes this enormously powerful way of accelerating that process and creating much more complicated event representations. And the story of a novel or the plot of a play is essentially just a very complex event that's been laid out, and you couldn't do it without language. Language also enlarges the imagination, and this is a very interesting quote from a poem by Wallace Stevens, "A Rabbit is King of the Ghosts." Your imagination, you just think of how this expands your sense of space. No matter, the grass is full and full of yourself. The trees around you are for you. The whole of the wideness of night is for you. A self that touches all edges. You become a self that fills the four corners of the night. You can't do that without language. You can't, it gives a push to the imagination, which is quite extraordinary. But it's still the same imagination. Early on in human history, this is a 25,000-year-old painting, it was clear that human beings like us were on the planet and were constructing imaginary worlds and, in a sense, perhaps representing the sacred. Many of these caves in France and Spain are inaccessible. You can't live in them. Some of them are a mile underground. They're absolutely pitch black. In the case of Neo, you actually have to swim underwater for a period and then come up again in order to get into the cave. So you can imagine what a technological feat it was to create these paintings deep, deep underground in places that were pitch black. They had to get somehow stone lamps in there. They found hundreds and hundreds of these little stone lamps, and they used animal oils and fats and so on to create little lamps, hundreds of little lamps to light these walls. And you can imagine what an extraordinary thing it must have been for a young person to be taken in there, presumably for initiation rites, far underground in the darkness of that pitch black environment, and then to go up and see these extraordinary representations on the wall. Absolutely no doubt that these were religious representations, they were visionary representations, and that was the height of art at the time, of course, and still is hard to match. It's extraordinarily good. I mean, are Picasso's bulls any better than those? I'm not sure they are. Those are very talented people. And in Ohio, of course, right nearby here, there's a famous burial mound that was called Serpent Mound. It's one extraordinary thing. I just saw one in Ireland. I was just in Dublin last week, and they had some extraordinary constructions in Ireland that are much older. This is about 1,200 years old, but the one in Ireland is more like 7,000 years old. And they were very complicated structures that required millions of man-hours of work to build, and what they are basically are telling stories. They're mythic beliefs imagined in art that are also, as you'll see in a minute, very mimetic. This is an Egyptian tomb about 3,500 years old, and it has a story of the soul's transmigration into another world, okay? And all of the relevant gods and astrological signs are in there. It's a very complicated representation. That one, by the way, was done with no audience in mind other than the dead pharaoh himself. That is, everybody who saw that presumably died immediately afterwards because they never left any witnesses of those tombs. Mythic culture is an interesting phenomenon because it incorporates the mimetic. Now, I'd say I've argued that the built environment architecture itself is very important in defining culture. And this is the Cathedral at Bourges. Now that structure in 1266 dominated that landscape to an incredible degree. In fact, you wonder how small communities like that could build such structures. And within it, there are literally hundreds of artifacts of all kinds of different kinds of arts and skills and crafts, as well as representations of all of the stories of the entire culture. So you had the Bible, you had the Stations of the Cross, you had all kinds of pictures of important religious icons and events, the tombs of important people in that part of the world. They kept all kinds of records of births and deaths. It was in one building an encapsulation of most of the things that were important to them as a society. And that building was there. You were born, you were baptized there, you spent your life there, and the social life of the town was held there. It was what I call a cognitive machine. It was a structure that communicated to you all of the things you had to know to be a member of that culture. So mythic culture is a very powerful thing, and it's incorporated right into the very building blocks of the physical environment in which people work and live. Mythic culture continues on to this day. That is, it is a culture built out of stories, which uses mimetic culture as a means of playing out the rituals and rhythms of the society. So, for example, this is the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Well, if you look at the array of people, this is in 1952, you have every major area of British society represented here: the military, the church, the academics, the various. You can see in this more recent picture that the presence of the military uniforms, the symbolism of all this, tells you a great deal about the society, and it tells you how to behave. And it's of course very mimetic. That is, the costumes are mimetic, the positioning of the people is mimetic, but the stories that guide the whole thing are governing the whole operation, and that's why it's predominantly a mythic culture. Of course, mythic culture can go wrong, and this is mythic culture that's employing the media, by the way, the very first really sophisticated use of the media to control masses of people. So there are ideas, in this case, ideas of early Germanic myths and Superman notions and so on, combined with mimetic means of control. That is, it took advantage of people's tendency to conform. It's extremely hard to imagine yourself in that audience wearing, let's say, long hair, headband, and tie-dyed shirt, right? I mean, it just wouldn't happen. The tendency to conform and to impose conformity on human beings is so great that it's very hard for us to. So it's ironic if you contrast that with the image that I showed earlier on of a carnival, which is also a form of, it's difficult to be at a carnival in a bowler hat, a black suit, and carrying an umbrella and reading the Wall Street Journal. It doesn't fit. So there is a tendency for people to conform, and it's an aspect of culture that we have to accept. Now, in mythic culture, one of the interesting things is that even architecture takes on stories. Now, this is the famous opera house at Venice that burned down some years ago and was reconstructed recently. La Fenice, it's called, and it's called the Phoenix, ironically, and it burned and then was rebuilt out of its own ashes, as it were. The thing about this is that was interesting, as was pointed out to me by my wife, who's an opera fan, was that the architect built this with the notion that the facade of the building, as you entered from the square, was very Apollonian. Apollonian is a word used by scholars very often to represent an abstract, contemplative form of thought that was represented by the Greeks and the god Apollo. Whereas when you went inside, it was a sort of bacchanalian orgy of color and light and so on. So it was a totally different type of mythic environment meant to make you celebrate, and it exercised the senses, and it was It was a different type of atmosphere. So in other words, you had a Dionysian culture inside and an Apollonian culture outside. So even the architect was influenced by the stories and myths of the culture in the way that the building was designed. And people at the time would have known that, and that their mood would have been affected and so on by the fact that the mimetic side, the design of the building, was guided by these stories. Now you might say, well, where does technology come into all of this? Well, those two things, the mimetic and the mythic, I think, describe a lot of important things about human society that are wired right in. That is, these are things that we are, and we can't do anything about it. I mean, we're just that way. We tell stories, and we imitate one another, and we gesticulate, and we communicate non-verbally, and we control one another's attention, and so on. Well, technology, I reflected on this a lot. What does technology do, and especially the media? Well, I think the most important thing from a cognitive point of view, from a strictly rigorous scientific point of view, is that it moves memory outside of the brain. So I just want to reflect on that for a minute. External memory means that you store memories in media other than the brain, okay? Now, this is an image of the temple of Aesculapius in Greece, and the physicians used to hang around there, and they had all their stuff up on the walls, all of their images and so on. They also had their gods and so on, and they treated patients there at the same time. I, fortunately, have never been a patient at that time of history. I don't know that I'd want to be, but the point is, it was a start. It was a moving towards the direction of external memories. Now, I'm just going to use the words, a few technical words here for a minute. The word engram was invented by Carl Lashley about 50 years ago to describe a memory record in the brain. I've coined the word exogram some years ago to describe a memory record outside the brain. And what memory technology has done is quite extraordinary. Of course, it started way back in time with very simple things like clay tablets and so on. But what has happened is that we've created new media that have different properties from the memory, from the engram systems of the brain, okay? The memory systems of the brain, the engram systems of the brain, basically there are 5 kinds. There's motor memories. Those are skills like playing the piano, talking a language. You know, if you learn French, that's a motor memory and so on. There are conditioned emotional responses. Those are the kinds of responses that are imposed on you by the environment, so that, you know, you see a picture of your old girlfriend or your old boyfriend, and the image elicits a change of mood, a whole series of changes that are Pavlovian. They're subconscious, and they're to some degree out of your control. And you're being played by the environment all the time in terms of your moods and so on. Those are different memories from motor memories, and they're encoded differently in the brain. Perceptual learning, that's your ability to recognize certain things. You become very good at your native tongue, for example, but you have trouble hearing other accents or other languages. Perceptual learning determines your familiarity with certain types of sensory environments. Semantic memory is your facts. You've got millions of those. And in neurological patients, which I've studied many times, you can see these different things break down independently. They're in different parts of the brain, okay? And then finally, there are in fact several kinds of semantic memories, but I won't go into that. And then finally, there's really the most new kind of memory that's been discovered, episodic memory, which is your really vivid flashbulb memories of the past. You know, the things that are so concrete that you can remember tiny details. You know, what somebody was wearing, or what had happened that day in the newspaper and so on. Very vivid personal memories, as opposed to abstract factual ones. So the brain, that's pretty well it. And your brain memories are limited in the sense that if you don't have any media, you can't get access to them. So if you imagine yourself living in a pre-literate society, so you don't even have writing, because the writing is a medium, of course, of external memory, you just have to rely on talking to people and whatever you can remember in your own mind. What tended to happen in people in cultures like that, they have a very strange sense of time compared with us. Because they didn't have clocks, they didn't have any of those things. As your life goes by, the things in the distant past fade away, you know. You have a very different shape. The shape of experience is very different in a world in which you can only rely on the memory systems of the brain. Whereas when you go to exogram systems, well, it's a whole different world. We've had a series of conferences with archaeologists who are interested in this because, of course, the built environment tells you a lot about how people thought about themselves and how they probably thought and remembered things. The built environment included things like temples and scribed stones and so on. Crafted devices, there are all sorts of systems of knotted ropes and so on. Long before there was systems of writing, there were ways that people tried to remember things, as well as symbols. Somebody's jewelry, somebody's necklace might be and contain important memories. And gradually they became more elaborate so that some of these old knotted cords could actually tell stories and so on. Painted and sculpted images, such as the ones you just saw, measuring instruments. Stonehenge, for example, was a way of an astronomical observatory of very great accuracy. The one I saw just recently in Ireland, which is even 1,000 years older than Stonehenge, was so precise that there was a tunnel in it. And once a year, at the summer solstice, the sun would directly enter that tunnel and hit a stone at the end of this long tunnel. And the illumination would last for 17 seconds. Then the place would plunge into pitch blackness again for an entire year until the next year on the solstice when another 17-second illumination. That's how precise they were. And that was a very long time ago. But that's a measuring instrument. It's a scientific measuring instrument. At Stonehenge, you could record 52-year eclipse cycles, for example. You had written records, of course, and as soon as you had written records, Egypt is the oldest example we have, but there were many other cultures that independently invented writing systems, and of course you had the Mesopotamian tablets, most of which were commercial transactions. You had Chinese writing. There are many different kinds of writing. But oddly enough, out of all the languages in the world, less than 5% had indigenous writing systems. Most of the languages of the world never invented their own writing system. It was a very difficult thing to invent, and it came recently. As writing systems became more sophisticated, we got things like modern books. And what many people don't know was that early books had no spaces between the words. And so all the letters were all jumped up. So you can imagine reading a book in which there's no spaces between the words, no pagination, no titles, no table of contents. In fact, you had to be an expert, and the early writing systems were meant to be performed publicly. You became an expert in a particular text, and you could perform it publicly. It took thousands of years to figure out ways of making the words and the ideas in books more accessible. So we are greatly advantaged by having this exographic environment because it organizes knowledge for us and makes us able to do things that we can't do in our heads. I can't flip through my representation of Shakespeare's plays in my head and find an exact quotation. You know, there's no way I can do that. In exograms, you suddenly have a bunch of options as far as memory retrieval and storage that you never had before. Mathematical notations are even more remarkable because mathematics is a story about finding the right notations. Mathematicians really are all about inventing external representations. You can't think, for example, about algebra with Roman numerals. There's no way you can do that. You have to have the right tools. And you might say, well, how can it be? How can it be that I rely on an external device to have a whole class of thoughts that I can't have without that external device? But it's true. This is an early estimate done 2,300 years ago, trying to estimate the diameter of the Earth. Now, if you look at exograms, look at the things they have. They're reformatable. You can't reformat your brain's memories. I'm sorry. They change somewhat quirky ways, but they're not reformatable. They're not quasi-permanent. They die with you, but more often than that, they change every single time you retrieve the memory. There's plenty of evidence for that. Unlimited capacity. I tried to estimate the size of the virtual world out there in exograms by studying the history of libraries and archives and so on, and I discovered that by the early 20th century, the number was essentially infinite. Since the electronic world, of course, it is truly infinite. There are no limits to the number of things we can store. We have new retrieval options. You can't Google your brain, unfortunately. I'd love to be able to do that, but I can't do that. And plus, these symbols perform work for us. They do things that we can't do in our heads. So this is all very important. Symbols, such as, for example, engineering diagrams, also permit us to do things that we can't think without those kinds of symbolism. And finally, you have, in the symbolic world, you've got these manuals, such as the dictionaries and so on the far side of that diagram, which allow you to get around inside the symbolic world itself. And the size of that world now is such that most of us work for it. Most of us hack out our entire lives trying to perhaps add one small amount of knowledge or something to that world. Now, here's the punchline. This world that we're bringing our children up in with these external media actually reprogram the brain. That is, our brains are not the same as a result of having these things. And this is not a trivial point. This is an important point. We just had a conference in France in which there were a number of neuroscientists and philosophers. And this point is now widely acknowledged, that the brain itself is, every natural representational system in the brain is configured by being immersed in a high-tech world, and especially the kind of electronic devices that we have now. And this is a classic representation out of psychology, which is the study of the psychology of dyslexia. The reading part of the brain and the spoken part of the brain are shown here. So the spoken word part is on the left, on your left, and the reading part on the right. And those two tracks are independent of one another. And what we know is that the reading part is entirely culturally imposed. It could not have evolved because there was no reading, there was no writing till a few thousand years ago. In fact, many parts of the world, there still isn't any reading system. I knew somebody personally who had been taken out of a tribal village in Africa, had never learned to read until 10 or 11, and was a neighbor of mine in London who was doing a PhD in computational chemistry at Imperial College London, one of the best chemistry departments in the world, and had gone from a pre-literate tribal culture to full highest level of literacy possible in one lifetime. But all of this part of the brain, this part here, does not exist and would not have existed in his brain had he not been exposed to writing at a certain point. That is probably equally true of the media. We just don't know what the media are doing. You know, the thing has happened so fast in the last 30 years. We don't know what 10, 20, 30,000 hours of immersion in certain types of media will do to a child's mind. And that's a very important thing for us to understand.